Hi, everyone. This is your host, Michael Shermer, the Science Salon podcast, part of the Skeptic Society and Skeptic Magazine, and one of our many ways of reaching out to as many people as we can with our educational mission of promoting science and reason. As usual, we appreciate your support for the podcast, which you can do through skeptic.com. You can do it via PayPal or Patreon or checks, credit cards. We have been contacted by one of the major podcast carriers to bring in advertising and that sort of thing. I'm not going to do that just yet. I think we're going to try to monetize this through our normal fundraising that we do at the society and see how that goes. Podcasting has really become a major player in the media landscape. I have done quite a few as a guest, and I do think it's really an amazing way to communicate our ideas to many more people at a great depth, much greater depth than we can through mainstream media. I learned that just by doing, podcasts like with Joe Rogan, where you can dive in for 2 or 3 hours on any topics you want. And so our podcast has kind of migrated toward doing science and science books, which is kind of how we started with the Skeptic Society lecture series at Caltech. It was mostly touring authors coming to LA. And then when we changed it to the Science Salon live events, they were always centered around an author's new book. And that kind of seems to be our niche. No one else is really doing that. And so every week, I bring you an author who has a new book. We get these books in the mail, couple a day, actually. They're starting to pile up in my living room. So my author this week is Hector Garcia. His book is Sex, Power, and Partisanship: How Evolutionary Science Makes Sense in Our Political Divide. I blurbed the book. I have a blurb back here in which I say, why has our political system become so divided and divisive along many lines? Why, for example, do pro-life conservatives support life-ending things like war, guns, and capital punishment? And why do free speech-supporting liberals want to silence speakers they disagree with? Proximate explanations are provided by political scientists, but deeper, ultimate answers must come from psychology and evolutionary theory, which the estimable Garcia provides in this illuminating work of science and politics, the timing of which cannot be more vital as our country is coming apart over seemingly intractable controversies. A must-read if you care about our future. Hector Garcia is the author of Alpha God, The Psychology of Religious Violence and Oppression. He's an assistant professor in the Department of Psychiatry at the University of Texas Health Science Center at San Antonio, and a clinical psychologist specializing in the treatment of post-traumatic stress disorder in combat veterans. He has published extensively on evolutionary psychology, stress and politics and organizations, and the interplay between war and masculine identity. His publisher is Prometheus Books, well known to have been founded by Paul Kurtz, one of the founders of the modern skeptic and humanist movement, and that's who also published his previous book, Alpha God. It's a great read. I read it back in manuscript form, and I read it yesterday on a plane, cross-country trip, and it's just gripping stuff because of everything that's happened in the last year and a half, since 2 years now, since Trump was elected. So we cover, of course, Trump and Hillary and Putin and all the kind of different ways of governance and how that relates to our evolutionary ancestry and what you can see in our primate cousins, particularly chimpanzees and bonobos and gorillas and so forth. And so Hector gets into all that. We discuss the naturalistic fallacy and the moralistic fallacy and the different issues that come up politically with just trying to explain these things from an evolutionary perspective. Evolutionary psychology seems to be a equal opportunity offender for both left and right. So we work around that and show why it is completely legitimate to examine these questions from this deeper perspective. And we get into looking at mostly current events in this light, as well as some historical events. And it's really a pretty interesting read. I encourage you to get the book if you can and read it. I know I always promote my author's books as positively as I can. I wouldn't have them on it if I didn't feel good about the book in the first place. But this was one of the better reads I've had. So with that, I give you Hector Garcia. Okay, let's go. Thanks for doing the show.
I'm delighted to talk with you.
So, as you know, I blurbed your book. So I read it, long time ago in manuscript form. And then yesterday I read it on a cross-country flight. And actually, it took on some new meaning because we've had another year of Trump since you were in the early drafts of the book. And I have to say, it kind of explains a lot of what's going on with Kim Jong-un and Putin and Trump. And, basically, these are like alpha chimps. kind of trying to outdo each other, like Putin taking off his shirt and Trump kind of bullying people around, and Kim Jong-un wearing his platform shoes and the high haircut for a little extra height. We're like apes. I can't believe it. It's come down after 2,000 years of advanced civilization. We're just a bunch of apes running around.
Yeah. We're working on very old hardware. And oftentimes our current surroundings don't match these adaptations that we've been carrying forward for so many millions of years. And we see that in figures like Trump, figures like the Kim dynasty, the Kims, where you have these large, aggressive, brash male leaders, and people respond to them. So yeah, that was part of the impetus for writing this book, is to bring that psychology under the light of scrutiny.
Before we dive into the book, give us a potted biography, how a psychiatrist gets into writing about alpha gods, your first book, and now sex, power, and partisanship with politics and psychology. How'd you get into all this?
Oh, boy. Well, first, I'm a psychologist, not a psychiatrist. I'm a clinical psychologist.
Clinical.
But, growing up, I grew up atheist. My dad was a neo-Darwinist at a time when it was really hard to be a neo-Darwinist. I grew up in El Paso, Texas, this sleepy southwestern border town, and my dad was a Depression baby. But that was the legacy that he imparted to me, and we talked about evolution. And it's been cooking for a long time. I love this field. I think it explains so much. I think there are so many fields that focus on surface level phenomenon, politics being one of those. But how frustrated does that leave us, especially with politics? I mean, how many of us have watched the news and just shaken our heads in utter disbelief and just not getting any kind of relief from the usual, pundits and political scholars?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So you're going for a deeper, ultimate explanation for our behaviors instead of the proximate psychology, politics. You're going more for an evolutionary psych explanation.
That's the beauty of these sciences. They give the ultimate explanation for our dislikes, our likes, our passions, whether we are inspired by the words of a president or repulsed by them. Our voting behaviors, our policy preferences, the why, the ultimate reason, the evolved purpose. And, once you understand these things from that light, it's like, oh, okay. We all know what a hotbed of irrational behavior politics can be. Has great explanatory power.
How do you address the charge against evolutionary psychology that you're just telling just those stories? These are not testable hypotheses. How do you know, your explanation for Trump's behavior or whoever is true, that you're not just making this up?
We have to be cautious to not put forth just so stories, right? Just because it seems like it fits. So the key is to back it up with empirical research, and you see how much that my books are grounded in what's out there. We need to do more testing, but it has to be solidly grounded in the literature. So that's key right there. And some things are testable. So, like, for example, our preferences for taller leaders. There was a study looking at 300 years of elections in the United States, presidential elections, and the vast majority of those, the taller of the two candidates won. And in every scenario, both candidates were taller than the average U.S. citizen.
Mhm.
So, we are drawn unconsciously to these tall, formidable, masculine leaders. We see this in business. We see this in church hierarchy. Height predicts whether you're a bishop or a priest in the Catholic Church, And this, I think, goes back to a time where that meant something. We wanted to ally ourselves with big people because they're the allies you want to have. But even though our current leaders will never represent us in an actual physical fight.
Well, you never know. Maybe Trump and Putin will get down in the mud and just settle the trade disputes this way.
Oh boy, a buddy of mine wrote an op-ed on this. Sebastian Junger wrote this op-ed about what would happen if Trump, who got how many deferments did he get for bone spurs to not go into Vietnam, versus Putin, who studied Sambo and judo since he was a little kid, and he was in the ranks of the KGB.
Yeah, he would kick his ass.
He would kick his ass.
Yeah,
that was the argument. Yeah. So, but appearances are everything, right? So what does Trump do repeatedly in the media? Like little Marco Rubio, little George Stephanopoulos, little Rocket Man.
Right.
And so he accentuates his largeness in comparison to his rivals. Over and over and over, Mike Pence went on the air and said, Trump has big shoulders.
Oh, yeah, the broad shoulders, yeah.
Who cares? Well, us monkeys care. Evolutionary scholars have talked about how broad shoulders were very essential for fighting prowess, especially in the use of handheld weapons, because it acts as like the fulcrum, I guess is the word. Does it really matter with modern day presidents?
Yeah, I remember Bush's sort of Texas swagger walk that he would use when he was, going to a meeting or a foreign diplomat meeting or something like that. He had those sort of broad shoulders and swaying him like a gorilla would or something like that. To the point almost where it was comical, where comedians would make fun of him for his swagger. But, a lot of people like that.
A lot of people like that, and it's very old. One thing that I write about a lot is the phylogenetic mismatch. That's when a trait no longer has the same benefits to us as it once did. So an outdated adaptation. And so we have to question, how this draw to large, aggressive leaders, does it really serve us? Does it hinder us? There are so many adaptations that we have to pose that question about.
There's a famous story of the first televised presidential debate between Kennedy and Nixon, where people that listened to it on the radio thought Nixon won, and people that watched it on television thought Kennedy won, because Kennedy was taller, more handsome. He had been on vacation, so he was tanned. Nixon, did his famous Nixon floppy sweat, and he always looked like he had a 5 o'clock shadow with his face, and he just kind of looked unkempt, and it's a striking difference when you look at the two of them standing there.
That's fascinating. So the thing that I often caution my reader anytime I speak publicly about these sciences is that if you don't understand your evolved psychology, others who understand it better than you are going to use it to manipulate you. Because in Trump's case, like I don't particularly, this is just, from the armchair, right? I've never interviewed him, but he seems like he's a bit impaired, I don't think he's particularly high IQ, but his handlers, they are shrewd and they know this literature. Mm-hmm. So for example, when you look at fear, endogenous fear, the ability the propensity to feel fear about any wide variety of stimuli, and it maps onto the natural curve, right? Some people are highly fearful of a high number of stimuli, and other people less so. Well, when you overlay political orientation onto that curve, it maps on almost perfectly. So people on the more conservative end tend to be more fearful about a wide variety of things, especially germs and especially outsiders.
Yeah.
So in our evolutionary past, outsiders are the ones who brought contagious diseases that we didn't have immunity for yet. So that could be potentially very dangerous. Does it serve our purpose now to have fear of outsiders? Because back then there was this microbiologic universe around us that we had no idea about. Now we know about hand washing. Now we know we have vaccines and antibiotics. Does it still serve us to be so xenophobic? So, people at the top, they know this research, and you have Trump going on, for example, when he's trying to gain support for building the border wall, saying immigrants are coming and they're going to infest our country.
Right. They're bringing germs and drugs and rapists and all that. Yeah, I'm sure it's tapping into those internal modules or networks that conservatives are more likely to have than liberals. So let's talk about that for a moment. You have a discussion of the Big Five personality inventory, particularly openness to experience and conscientiousness, and how liberals and conservatives and men and women differ on those.
Yeah. So women and liberals and liberal men tend to score a lot higher on openness to experience, and there's research suggesting that may have served a function way back in our evolutionary past that allowed us to immigrate, right? That allowed us to travel to new lands, encounter new people, new resources. So liberals tend to be far more xenophilic, interest in new people, interest in new cultures, which may have facilitated that. Men, on the other hand, generally speaking, tend to be more xenophobic, and conservatives tend to be more xenophobic, and that would have allowed people to stay put and not, risk the dangers of immigrating, which could be very dangerous in our evolutionary past. So, but it's not only fear of germs and that kind of thing that pose such a big threat. And one of the things I talk about is, what are the evolutionary pressures that shaped our orientations? Part of it was the threat of outside tribes, and that's what I unpackage to a great extent throughout both of my books. So our evolutionary past was not a place where I would like to live. I mean,
no.
It was not uncommon.
I mean, what you're getting at in that section of your book is there's a delicate balance between being open to new people, new environments, and all that, because if you're too self-contained, you can't adapt to a changing environment. So you need some genetic diversity, you need some food diversity, you need some environment diversity, and you need some new people coming in. On the other hand, it's a dangerous world. Other people in other tribes are probably not to be trusted. Jared Diamond makes this point when he discusses when he first went to Papua New Guinea doing some birding. And so he was hanging out with the Papua New Guinean natives there, and they'd be down a hiking path or something looking for birds, and they'd encounter somebody that they didn't recognize. Now, Jared, if he's in LA, you would just shake somebody's hand and say, hi, partner. And his buddies are like, are you kidding me? Let's get the fuck out of here. This guy could kill us. There could be other people hiding. We don't just shake people's hands.
Or skewer him with an arrow before he tells his buddies we're out here.
Right.
So that threat of so what was incredibly common was male coalitions forming within the tribe, planting intergroup raids, so conducting a raid on the outside tribe, slaughtering all the men, taking all the women for, as sexual slaves, and eventual, just absorbing women into their clan. That was incredibly common. So when we apply our evolutionary forensics, when we focus them on political partisanship, especially conservatism, the fingerprints of this violence are all over them. Not only in conservatism, but liberalism. So I think both were kind of adaptations to male violence. So you take, for example, the robust chimpanzee. We can learn a lot from looking at other species. And one of the things that I try to do is take William James's advice and that, like, we have to make the natural seem strange, he says, because most of these adaptations are so unconscious and they're so intuitive. We say, of course, we love our children. Of course, we want a sexy partner. Of course, without realizing what the purpose is. So one of the ways of doing that is looking at other species, and so when you look at how males compete, they compete within the in group, right? So male chimpanzees, they will compete for sex. The more dominant individuals, more dominant males, they tend to have more copulations. Sometimes they can monopolize copulations in the whole troop. They tend to have better access to food. Well, in many ways, what I argue is that liberalism was a psychological adaptation to adapt to those kinds of hierarchical arrangements and to prevent despotic males from impinging on the evolutionary fitness of those beneath them. Because given, left to their own devices, they will. The classic example, I think that one of the most profound examples is this Moroccan sultan, and I think in the 1700s, who made the Guinness Book of World Records for number of children. He had 500 concubines and 888 children. Some suggest it may have been 1,000. Windfall of reproductive fecundity, right? How did he do that? Well, I see you nodding, so you know who I'm talking about. His name is Ismail the bloodthirsty. So how did he achieve this? By earning that name, I assure you. By slaughtering all the men from the outside tribe, taking their women, taking their goods, fortifying his cities, feeding his armies. This was a very inegalitarian effort.
Remember that research a few years ago about genetic research on the descendants of Genghis Khan, where something like 20% of all Mongolians are descended from this one guy.
That's stunning.
Yeah. And I was just doing a debate with a theist over the problem of evil. And anyway, these are evangelicals who think that the Bible is the inerrant word of God and it's the perfect moral book of guidance and so on. So I just read a few stories about some of their heroes, like Solomon, who had 700 wives and 300 concubines. And basically, these guys in the Old Testament, they're all like Afghan warlords now.
They were warlords. And male mate competition was behind all of that. Moses ostensibly got these orders from God: go into the rival tribe, kill all the men, take all the women. So their men have a fitness incentive to do that. So liberalism, with all its focus on checks and balances, with all its focus on redistribution of wealth, is in many ways a psychological adaptation to prevent despotic males from right. taking over and impinging on your ability to get your genes out.
Right. If you're not one of those alpha males, I mean, the sex ratio is 50-50, and if one guy is getting 50% of the women, what are the other guys going to do? So they have to make a coalition and do something to work around that as a strategy for reproduction.
No question, and this is one of the areas where I think evolutionary science should inform policy. There's research looking at in societies where men can have more than one wife, there's a greater number of revolutions. So right. Who fights revolutions? Well, young men fight revolutions. And we see this pattern in other primates where young males will form these coalitions to overthrow the reigning male. So if we want social stability, we have to understand our evolved psychology and let it inform the policies that we make.
Yeah, on that point, let me just draw you into your very first chapter on the moralistic fallacy and the naturalistic fallacy. I get pushback on this a lot too, because I think we should use all the science we have, everything we have, to inform our policy. But if you go a little too far, then you get the Humean wall, as I call it, the naturalistic fallacy. You can't derive an ought from an is, which I think is nonsense. But I mean, if you're not going to derive ought from the way things are, then where are you getting it? Revelation? I mean, we have to study the way things are to figure out what ought to be, which is why I think your book is so important to know these things. And if conservative advisors to presidents are reading this literature, then liberal advisors should do the same thing. But this idea that if it's natural, then we can't change it, that's another problem, right? Liberals in particular think, well, if there's a genetic basis to it, if we're just chimps, then there's no hope for our species. Why is that false?
I always make the point in every talk that I give to just define that naturalistic fallacy, and that's the idea that just because something's arrived at through genetic means, that it's desired, inevitable, or ethical, because oftentimes it's none of those things, and we can outsmart our genes. I mean, I'm wearing eyeglasses, for example. That's one example. Any piece of technology is an example of how we can outsmart our genes. That's who we are as a species. But people find this science scary. It's scary to some people. They think, well, if I admit this, am I giving up some self-control? But Michael, to the contrary, I argue that if we're not aware of these impulses, especially the bad ones, the darker ones, we're more likely to enact them without thinking. If we understand them, then we can make more rational, conscious, humane choices. But again, you're right. It can be like, it can be like good psychotherapy. It can tell you not necessarily what you want to see, but what you need to see.
That's why I think of our Constitution as something like the eyeglasses for government. It's a technology, a system set up with the checks and balances, in the sense that our founding fathers seemed to be intuitive cognitive psychologists who knew, well, everybody wants power, and the more they get, the more they want, and they're going to dominate and take. So we got to have lots of checks and balances. And it was
no question.
It's a pretty good system. It seems to work pretty well. As worried as everybody is about Trump, he hasn't really done all that much. There's been a lot of checks on his actions, and particularly since the midterms. He's just not getting his way as much as he would like.
Well, the Constitution, the American experiment, is really grounded in liberal psychology, the psychology underlying political liberalism. As we were trying to get away from the yoke of our colonialist overlords back in the day. So absolutely.
A couple other points. I'm just going to rifle through some of the more salient points I thought you made in the book. Again, on this naturalistic issue, that research shows that 30 to 60% of the variance in our political preference is due to genetic factors. I mean, if you ask somebody why you're conservative or why you're liberal, they'll just rattle off all the good arguments. I'm pro-choice and gun control, or whatever. But really, and it's not even really, I was raised to be a conservative or liberal because my parents were, although that has some influence. It really sometimes comes down to a grounding in just your temperament, what you prefer, which is largely genetically programmed. So back to your big five, if I'm just naturally open to experience, I love travel. I have a lot of books about travel in my bookcase, maps of the globe, and I take a lot of trips and I enjoy all that. And I feel comfortable when I physically go somewhere new I've never been to. I'm excited about it. Other people are not. They're anxious, and that's just physiology. And so that, as you described, translates down the line where you don't really see all the connections, but translates down the line. I prefer to hang out with people that are conservative, or I prefer to hang out with people that are liberal, because I'm more comfortable just physically. And it almost comes down to just kind of a physicality of liberalism or conservatism.
Oh boy, and those tendencies far predate anything resembling political ideology, or certainly political parties. So absolutely, and especially those concerning fear. But again, they can be used to manipulate us. So during the midterm elections, what was up with that migrant caravan that was advancing towards the border? How did that get manipulated? Fox News was airing segments saying they're going to be carrying all kinds of disease, and even smallpox.
Right.
Smallpox has been eradicated,
right.
But that doesn't matter to the naive viewer. I mean, that is going to resonate, and that's going to take you to the polls. The sad thing is usually to vote for policies that are not in one's best interest.
Right. Talk about that research on disease, contagion, and to what extent we need the right balance between some genetic diversity, but not too much, because the risk of outsiders coming in could have brought diseases in our environment of our ancestry.
Well, look, is it the big question I have, Michael? Is this a mismatch now? is this a mismatch as we are moving towards a globalistic union of nations, whether we want to or not? We're sharing technology, we're sharing cultures, we're immigrating. That's going to happen whether we like to or not. Is that a liability? I mean, why couldn't we cooperate on a global level and share technology and infrastructure? It's not for practical reasons. Those reasons are emotional. But yeah, it's fascinating, and there are things impacting us that we have no awareness of. So, for example, researchers found that the more you move away from the equator, the more politically liberal you tend to be. Well, the equator is where you see more contagious diseases because of the heat, and for other factors. But it's we don't have as much conscious control over our political preferences as we may think we have.
Your geography matters. It's incredible.
Geography matters.
Yeah, you have the study from the World's Value Survey Association between 1981 and 2008. They asked over 250,000 people from 97 countries to identify themselves along the left-right political spectrum with a question. In political matters, people talk of the left and the right. How would you place your views on this 10-point scale, generally speaking? Across this ethnically, geographically, religious, technologically, and politically diverse sample, 80% were able to place themselves along this dimension. So you get this left-right dimension in almost every country, even in European countries where they have multiple political parties. They sort of cluster to the right or cluster to the left, although they vary a little bit within there. It does seem like it's inevitable. You're always going to have something like liberals and something like conservatives. Even if there's some of us crazy libertarians that are fiscally conservative and socially liberal, or so, we're always going to be kind of a small group. Like, sort of call myself a classical liberal now because some libertarians are sort of goofy and fringy. but really, it sort of does come down to that, and that comes down to this. How do I feel being with these people and listening to those ideas versus those? And that does seem to be largely programmed in from our ancestry.
Yeah, I mean, and there is ample room to change your beliefs based on incoming information, but the challenge is doing that in an increasingly engineered social media world where we're put into these echo chambers, often intentionally by people who want us there, to only get information that confirm our beliefs. That's scary because there are people who know this science. I mean, even outside countries, look what happened during the election. So Russian troll farms really knew what the hot button issues were for liberals and conservatives, and they poked them. They poked them and poked them, got us to fight each other in the streets. So we need to know this.
Yeah, right.
We're incredibly more vulnerable if we don't. And there's research showing that conservatives, people with the underlying psychological traits that tend to be drawn towards conservative politics, I think explaining it in that order is important because once again, the psychology far predated politics as we know it today. They tend to be more gullible. They tend to be more credulous, so they can be manipulated easier, especially when fears are prodded. And this makes me, I'm pretty left of center, but this makes me angry and protective of my conservative countrymen because they're getting manipulated like crazy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, in my blurb for your book, I asked, why has our political system become so divided and divisive? Why, for example, do pro-life conservatives support life-ending things like war, guns, and capital punishment? And why do free speech supporting liberals want to silence speakers they disagree with? So you talk about this a little bit, but I was just reading George Lakoff's book, Moral Politics, where he talks about the metaphor of the nation as a strict father family versus a nurturing family. And you talk about that as well, sort of a male-dominated family versus a female-themed family.
Right.
Something like that. Do we want a nurturing parent or do we want a strict father, parent? And a lot of conservatives, they seem to want, they want daddy, to lay down the law. And
yeah. And a lot of this came out of our dangerous ancestral history. So yeah, people have noticed that, like Lakoff, like Chris Matthews, who said, Republicans are the daddy party. and liberal and Democrats the mommy party. But what I unpackage is where this came from. What were the forces that forged that gender direction? So, take for example, right-wing authoritarianism is kind of one of the best measures that we have to look at the underlying psychology of political conservatism, which was developed in the aftermath of World War II, when the whole world was trying to decide what the hell gave us Adolf Hitler. How did that happen, right? So, Canadian psychologist Robert Altemeyer refined the scale used to measure this phenomenon, and it had three major factors. One is deference to authority figures. And across our history, those authority figures have been male, and they've usually been big males, right? This is very old. Adherence to rules and customs and protocol, which is often set by the authorities, right? And aggression against outsiders, which is often sanctioned by the authorities. So what is striking to me is that nobody's really developed this before, is that maps on almost perfectly to the social organization of the military. Because for example, deferring to authority, you need that in the military. That is part of the rank structure. So, how quickly would an army get slaughtered if decision making were democratic and soldiers weren't especially obliged to obey commands? That has a practical function. So does adhering to rules and customs. I mean, rules are of any kind of rule is more strictly enforced in the military, and conformity and aggressing against outsiders. So that threat has really shaped our political psychology, and those preferring that order, those preferring giving up power to the most dominant males, they're haunted by the ghosts of our ancestral past, so to speak, because doing so could mean the difference between life and death, like turning inward to the band of brothers that was going to protect you from the outside tribe, or go raid them when we were starving to death. Again, how much does that serve us now?
Okay, I'm going to play. Hang on one second.
Okay,
I'm going to play for you. I've done this on one other podcast. It's really fun. One of my favorite films, A Few Good Men. So, Tom Cruise sort of plays this liberal-like lawyer trying to get his clients, protect his clients who were accused of killing this Marine,
right.
when in fact they were ordered by the Jack Nicholson, tough guy, conservative Marine colonel to rough up this slacker Marine, and things go wrong and the Marine dies, and so it's a trial. And so Cruise is trying to push him on this, did you order the code red? That is to rough this guy up, and that's kind of an off the books thing, and so Nicholson sells him on, this is the famous, you want the truth, you can't handle the truth stuff, and he gives that little speech. Now the screenwriter for this film, I found out, was a liberal trying to kind of characterize this conservative position that we live in a world with walls, it's a dangerous world, and you want me on that wall. But really, this is what conservatives, this is kind of how they think. So I'm going to just play that for you here.
That's what you told Lieutenant Kendrick to do. Object! When it went bad, you cut these guys loose! Your Honor, you had markers inside a phony transport. Your Honor, you doctored the logbook. Damn it, Captain! You coerced the doctor.
Consider yourself in contempt.
Colonel Jessup, did you order the code red?
You don't have to answer that question.
I'll answer the question. You want answers? I think I'm entitled. You want answers? I want the truth! You can't handle the truth! Son, we live in a world that has walls, and those walls have to be guarded by men with guns. Who's gonna do it? You? You, Lieutenant Weinberg? I have a greater responsibility than you can possibly fathom. You weep for Santiago and you curse the Marines. You have that luxury. You have the luxury of not knowing what I know, that Santiago's death, while tragic, probably saved lives, and my existence, while grotesque and incomprehensible to you, saves lives. You don't want the truth because deep down in places you don't talk about at parties, you want me on that wall. You need me on that wall. We use words like honor, code, loyalty. We use these words as the backbone of a life spent defending something. You use them as a punchline. I have neither the time nor the inclination to explain myself to a man who rises and sleeps under the blanket of the very freedom that I provide, and then questions the manner in which I provide it. I would rather you just said thank you and went on your way. Otherwise, I suggest you pick up a weapon and stand a post. Either way, I don't give a damn what you think you are entitled to. Did you order the code red? I did the job. Did you order the code red? You're goddamn right I did!
Boom.
Yeah, Michael, that nails it, doesn't it? That nails it.
Really? I mean, this is, half the country, they like that.
Yeah.
They want Jack Nicholson on that wall. They want strong men, broad-shouldered, tough, that are going to defend us, because that's the point of the military. And to be honest, that's the world we do live in. I'm kind of a globalist. I think we should break down all the barriers and have open trade and travel and all that stuff. But, we're a long ways from that.
We're a long ways from that, and we can go too far in the other direction, and I think some of my fellow lefties are literal. Most of us aren't, but I think literally want open borders, like complete. And we're not ready for that.
No, we're not ready for that.
That's not realistic.
No.
But the irony is, based on what I've unpackaged, is that what conservatives have most to fear. Psychological conservatives are the psychological conservatives from the rival tribe, because they're the ones who are waiting to conduct raids on, not the liberals.
Right.
The big-hearted liberals are the threat. The
Right.
big-hearted, empathic, tree-hugging liberals, they're not the threat.
Right. Yeah, I remember back to Trump with in the primaries, he couldn't attack Carly Fiorina in the same way, so he went after her looks. Remember that? I always thought that was there was something primate-ish about that also.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's yeah, myself and Jane Goodall have both written about how he and his camp emit a certain chimpanzee aroma in that sense. He's a chest thumper, Yeah. And interestingly, the primaries, the lead up to the election, wow, so many people were boasting about their male prowess. Like Ben Carson was running around talking about, beating people up with bricks and rocks and stuff, and something that his contemporaries were like, no, I don't remember that.
Yeah.
Even
trying to convey how tough he was. They were all doing that. And then remember the debate where just the days before the debate, people were making fun of the size of Trump's hands. And then he practically challenged him to a short arm inspection right there on the stage. All right, fellas, let's drop him and show what we've got. My God.
Meanwhile, the rest of the world is just appalled at us. That's the thing. And, and as a scientist writing about this stuff, you kind of might get accused of not being, objective, because there's so much material to be extracted from the Trump phenomenon. But the whole world knows it. The whole world knows there's something just not right.
Yeah. Yeah, well, back to that metaphor, if you ask conservatives why they're conservatives, well, I'm in favor of small government and lower taxes and balancing the budget and all this stuff. They're not. The government grows just as much under conservative administrations as it does liberal. And furthermore, they're not really in favor of freedom, because, they want to take women's reproductive freedoms away from them. So it isn't small government or freedom. It's really discipline on the family, the nation as a family. So women that get pregnant out of wedlock, that's a disciplinary problem. They need to get their act together and get married and refrain from having sex before marriage and use protection if they're going to do it. And so the problem with abortion is they're using the conservative argument against liberals, or pro-life against pro-choice, is they're using abortion as a reproductive technology, when really the problem is they're just not disciplined enough.
Yeah, absolutely.
And same thing with guns. If they're, we don't. We're worried about terrorism, and 3,000 people died, and a couple die every year. So we have to have this $1 trillion, defense system and national security and homeland security. We all have to take all our shoes off at the airport. On and on and on. Meanwhile, 35,000 people die of guns every year. So they're not worried about people dying. It's guns. They say, well, it's for freedom. Well, what is it really? It's about, protecting my little space. My gun is, I'm going to protect my home, just like the military is to protect our nation. And it really does come down to those kind of basics, keeping the outsiders out, the dangerous, bad people out, with guns or military or whatever, disciplining, our citizens, and so on. This is why conservatives are against social systems like food stamps and stuff. Those people are just lazy.
Oh boy, I think you're right on, and there's so much to unpackage in what you just said. I think what the scary part is where certain policy preferences become a tribal meme for no other reason than billionaires want it to become a meme, right? Like global warming, for example. But a lot of what you said too just underscores the fact that conservatism really is driven by male reproductive interests. So when we measure political orientation across the globe, hands down, the most conservative nations are Islamic nations. I think they stack the top 20. I mean, most of the top 20 most conservative nations. And those are also the nations with the least gender equality, no, hands down. Well, when you look at all these practices that contribute to low gender equality, it's all based on fear of cuckoldry and preventing cuckoldry. So cuckoldry comes from that term comes from the cuckoo bird that suckers other birds into rearing its young, which is for men, that's a big evolutionary fear because our human offspring spend so much time in dependency. The worst outcome is you take all these risks, expend all this energy, raising a child that's not yours. So anything from swathing women in burqas so that they're not appealing to other men, to keeping them restricted to the home, to not allowing them to travel or work or go anywhere without a male chaperone, to clitoridectomies, it's all based on this male reproductive imperative, and that runs right in line with political conservatism. And it's often the conservatives in America who are railing so hard against any kind of legislation that gives women access to reproduction. And one refrain that you hear over and over and over is that birth control removes a potential disincentive for extramarital intercourse, like STDs and pregnancy.
Right.
That's astounding to me. That is so. This is tying back to this really old psychology. Forget about the fact that contraception would prevent actual cuckoldry. It doesn't matter. Men have had this fear of being cuckolded before we had contraception. So the act of having sex with an outside man is something that incenses us, especially men.
Yeah, birth control is just 60 years old, and the fear of cuckoldry is 6 million years old or whatever.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. But this influences policy, and people don't understand why. I mean, where it all comes from, and that's what I'm attempting to do. Is like, where does this come from? We have to look at these stances that we take with so much emotion, and understand why. Because oftentimes people don't understand. It's just kind of what the tribe has deemed relevant.
Yeah. So we've been pounding on conservatives for a while. You talk about John Jost's research about why people vote Republican or why people are conservative. My beef with that was that it's treating conservatism and Republicans like it's a disorder. Like, these people have a problem. What is the problem? It's almost like it's a cancer on our society. We have to fix them. And I think that's the wrong approach. That I like your approach, that there's a reason people think like that. And a good reason, deep into our evolutionary past. And if we don't recognize that, they're not going to just come around through some rational arguments. There has to be some other approach.
It certainly allows more understanding and compassion. I gave a talk on the book recently, and somebody came out to me afterwards and said, I really hated Republicans before I heard what you had to say, and now it makes sense, and I'm not so mad at my relatives, because they're it comes from this old evolutionary fear. But no, I think that the underlying psychological diversity that gave us downstream, a range of political orientation was adaptive for us. It allowed us to prevent from getting wiped out by the rival tribe, and allowed us to populate the world. But again, there are so many things in our evolutionary past that may serve as a mismatch in the modern day. The example I give as a frame of reference is, our love for fatty, sugary foods, which were very scarce in our ancestral past. That aided us. Does it aid us now when we have McDonald's
Right.
and epidemics of morbid obesity and type 2 diabetes?
Yeah, all of modern civilization is something of a mismatch to our evolutionary past. Tie this in with your previous book, Alpha Gods, right? What was the title of your previous book? Alpha Gods, right? Alpha God, the psychology of religious violence and oppression, right? And why is it conservatives seem to lean harder on? I mean, it's not like Democrats are all atheists; they're not, but their God is a kinder, gentler God than the Christian God. Now Christians, like these evangelicals I was with just this weekend, they act like they love the kinder, gentler Jesus, but really they're pretty hard asses on discipline, and their God they like the sort of angry God, I think, who lays down the laws.
Well, that's precisely it. So the primary question I seek to answer with Alpha God is, why do you have this being with all the omnis, omnipresent, omniscient, omnipotent, never die, it doesn't have a body like us, never dies? Why is this being so interested in sex? Why is it so interested in submission displays from its subordinates? Why is it so interested in territory? Obviously because he's based on us, and we carry forward this ancestral heritage into, we look into the clouds, and not only do we see ourselves, but, we see a dominant male primate. And so religions that have a dominant male primate at its apex, that want us to give up sex to him, to give up resource to him, food, fan burnt offerings into the sky. It's emotionally intuitive to us. And the thing about the Bible is, it has something for everybody. The Old Testament is based on this harsh warlord, territory acquiring, rule enforcing God. And the New Testament is based on, this incarnation of God that's kind and inclusive and
Right.
understanding.
More feminine.
And more feminine. So in that respect, it kind of has something for everybody. So, I think a great study would be to look at, does political orientation reflect among Christians, what kinds of passages, what kinds of philosophies in both the Old and New Testament do people resonate with? Clearly, Jesus was a liberal. That we can say.
Yeah, but when did he become a conservative and a profit-seeking conservative? And Jesus wants you to be rich.
Oh boy, like the prosperity gospel and all that kind of nonsense. I mean, Jesus if he existed, he was a rebel. He fought the power structure, and that's what a lot of conservatives don't just gloss. It just goes right through them. I mean, he fought the moneyed interests that were oppressing people in ancient Jerusalem and tore up their marketplace. I mean, this guy was a rebel.
What is your sense of why the monotheisms arose when they did, when polytheism and animism had such a much longer history?
Well, I think, my understanding is gleaned from other scholars who have done, a far more thorough job than I have at looking at that. Like Robert Wright, I cite him a lot in his book Evolution of God, and his argument, along with other scholars, which makes so much sense, is that period, that the biblical age was a time of incredible growth during the Fertile Crescent. So there was a lot of competition for resources, huge population growth. There was a need to consolidate armies, to consolidate identities, and partly that was done through consolidating gods. So slowly, these monotheistic religions, the number of gods started shrinking. and that helps to keep armies together, and so you don't have these fractures. One group's worshiping another god and is not going to go to war with your god, and so forth. So I think it has militaristic value, especially at that time when it was, again, that was a terrible time to live. People regularly hacked each other to pieces. So you needed a god. You needed a powerful, singular god to lead people into battle.
I also think of it as sort of the ultimate eye in the sky, keeping track of your moral behavior when police forces and systems of government checks were not really in place.
Right.
And if you think you got away with it, you didn't, because there's an eye in the sky watching you, and it'll all be settled in the cosmic courthouse when the scales will be presented, and we're going to weigh everything you did. It's kind of a way. It's like those experiments where they have free donuts or whatever. You make a donation if they put a set of eyes there. People give more money, or the shadow of enforcement, where like the police will park a squad car on an intersection. There's nobody in the squad car, but everybody slows down, and it's
right.
People behave better if they think they're being watched. So
you're absolutely right. There's studies looking at people are less likely to cheat in lab games if there's a picture of eyes on the wall.
Yeah.
But yeah, it served a practical purpose. It allowed us to cooperate far beyond genetic kin, right? Who you have an inclination to cooperate with because you share genes. But yeah, if a god, if an all-powerful being is watching your actions, you're less likely to cheat on the reciprocal exchange. There's going to be more social harmony.
Yeah. What's the statistics on left, right, liberal, conservative religiosity? I haven't looked at that in a while. I mean,
oh boy,
it's not like liberals are all atheists. They're not. Religious rates are still pretty high.
They're not, but I don't know the stats, but I think that probably most atheists are probably more liberal.
Yes, for sure.
That we can see.
That for sure, yeah.
And it fits in with this, questioning the power structure, questioning the primate dominance hierarchy. I mean, that's something that liberals do a lot of, and so do atheists. I mean, if there's an atheist leader, so to speak, that messes up, he's out.
Right.
They question the rules of the group, constantly questioning the rules. So I think it has a draw for those who are liberally minded in that sense. And
yeah, just other points that were striking to me in your book, that by analyzing our genome, researchers were able to calculate that for a period after the introduction of agriculture, one man reproduced for every 17 women. With a 50-50 sex ratio, wow, that's quite a disparity.
That's quite a disparity.
Yeah, so what are some of the implications of that?
The implications are that if we base policy purely on male reproductive interest, people are going to be oppressed. So yes, male psychology may have protected us in our ancestral past. It protects us today. I mean, who comprises the military? It's almost all men. But if unregulated, that's an invitation for abuse, because men have a fitness incentive to have more than, as we see in the case with the world record holder Ismail the bloodthirsty.
Right.
So there's a fitness incentive to have more than other people, whether that's measured in a number of concubines or billions of dollars.
All right, I'm going to get you in trouble now, or maybe both of us, talking about cognitive differences and preferences for closed, rule-based systems between females and males. So here you're talking about some research with Simon Baron-Cohen. Sasha's cousin, by the way, Borat, that guy.
Is that his cousin?
Yeah, they're really cousins, yeah.
Oh my gosh, that's hilarious.
Isn't that wild?
That's hilarious. That's wild.
So Simon studies autism and other related systems. So let's see, here you're talking about, in addition to overall differences in the preference for social hierarchy, men and women generally process information differently, with men showing a tendency to prefer what Baron-Cohen describes as closed systems that are predictable, factual, rule-based, knowable, and to some extent controllable, such as computers. For this reason, men generally tend to perform better at math, physics, and engineering, and are far overrepresented in those fields. Here, let us again avoid the pitfall of confusing increased likelihood with determinism or some preposterous conclusion that such research means or even intends to argue that women can't excel in these fields. They can and often do. Indeed, studies find that sex differences in these areas are small and more visible primarily on the extreme ends of ability and achievement.
Yeah.
But differences remain, and we continue to look into the gaps for the wealth of understanding they provide. It is striking that while socio-cultural factors may explain some of the sex variances, a fairly substantial body of research has found higher autism rate traits among those in science, technology, engineering, and math, STEM fields, than those in non-STEM fields. That's super interesting. Because people at like Caltech and MIT, which is, the top 0.01% on those in those fields, they're half of them are on the spectrum. I mean, you can see it when you walk around campus, but there's studies on this. Yeah,
no question. Well, So nobody had noticed that before, and I don't know if you've had the same experience. When you start writing a book, you're teaching yourself. You're discovering so much, and one of the things that was very, very striking to me is how many of the core traits that we see in autism, you see in the cognitive abilities of people on the right. And that is no way to pathologize political conservatism, but it does point to this dynamic that, conservative psychology represents, kind of a male-oriented psychology. So the ability to empathize, the ability to read facial gestures or make facial gestures, language ability, tends to be lower in conservatives. And the inverse, it tends to be higher in liberals, which has adaptive value if we developed liberalism as a way to move to new lands and interact with other people. So
if you have more of those kind of facial recognition, mind reading skills, you're more likely to go into jobs that involve other people, teaching, nursing, medicine, psychiatry, whatever. And people on the other end of the spectrum, well, programming computers, you don't have to even see people.
That's right. And there is a correlation between those kinds of professions and political orientation. So people with autism have difficulty with open systems because they're not predictable.
Right.
There's not a set of rules that you can break apart and understand, and operationalize in an easy way. So, that's why people with autism tend to have incredible discomfort when interacting with other people. They tend to do really good at computers and math and engineering because they're closed systems. There are rules that can be predicted.
You see, let's talk about the Google memo for a moment. Where Jamie was writing that memo about James Damore was writing that memo about not cognitive differences so much as interest differences. Like, what are the kinds of jobs you're interested in doing? And so it's pretty clear men and women are, in terms of mean IQs, are the same. We're only talking about bell curve width at the very extreme ends. As Pinker says, men, more geniuses, more dunces.
Right.
And so, of course, the creme de la creme of Google engineer programmers are going to pick the top 0.0001%, 8 standard deviations out or whatever. So you're going to have slightly more men than women there. But the other explanation is that, from a very early age, boys prefer to play with toys and mechanical things with wheels and gadgets and gears, and women girls prefer dolls and, softer objects and things like that. I have a son and a daughter. Every parent that has that has seen that.
Me too.
So
striking.
But you've added another dimension here with this, closed versus open systems. I'm just thinking out loud here. Are they tied together? So if you like sort of mechanical things, maybe that's more of a closed system, or I'm not sure. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah, they're closed systems. There are rules and laws that govern them that you can figure out. And humans can be, especially if you don't have great theory of mind skills, humans can be totally mystifying. You have to be able to understand that another mind is there and has intentions and wants and desires. So that's something that and of course we're talking probabilistically. This is not to say that all conservatives are one way. This is not to say that all men are one way or all women are one way. But there certainly is a trend there that speaks to our gendered political psychology. And really the purpose for me, just unraveling that for examination was to establish that, to look at all the other things that brings. Because war studies is my big interest in how do we prevent that? How do we prevent societal breakdown? How do we prevent going to war when a big chest thumping leader says we have to?
Yeah, let's talk about that for a moment, because Pinker and I have been chasing these sort of long-term trends in the decline of violence, but for the peculiarity of our electoral college, had Hillary been elected president, would we even be talking about all these apparently reverse trends, and things are going backwards, and the rise of authoritarianism and so on? We just had 8 years of Obama, and then if we had another 4 years of Hillary, we'd be talking about the continuation of the trends of expanding moral sphere and more tolerance for leaders that are not the traditional male. But we've had this one little reversal, and then maybe with Brexit and a few of the other isolated places, the rise of Putin, maybe. It feels like a trend in the other direction. I wonder if it really is, or if it's just a little blip on the long-term trend, in the right direction. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so you may be right. So if you were to graph this up close, you might see a trend that's jagged like this, with the stepwise in a down direction. But stepping back, it may go all the way down. This might be a blip, but these blips are potentially very dangerous.
That's true.
I mean, what we know is that other primates will emulate dominant members of the monkey troop.
Oh, right.
And even infants, even toddlers rather, they'll emulate those that they believe is seem to be higher status. So what happened during the campaign and since Trump's election is you see a big surge in hate crimes, violence against outsiders of whatever variety, whatever form of outsider they tend to assume. You see that. So people are emulating this. People take they take the lead of the dominant male who's saying that maybe neo-Nazis or KKK are potentially some good people on that side. They take strength from that. They take courage from that.
Yeah.
That's a scary piece.
That's true. Yeah, that's why we have to stay vigilant on that. And then what is your thoughts on the antiquity of war? We use this word in a particular way. I have a section on that in the Moral Arc where Douglas Fry pushes back against Pinker, for example, and the people that say war is in our genes or whatever. It's like, no, our ancestors were pretty peaceful, and it wasn't until agriculture and hierarchy and dominance entered in. Now, I'm skeptical of that position, but that's their position, and I think it depends on what you mean by war. Because of course they don't have large-scale 10,000 strong armies, because there weren't that many people.
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think I want to tie in something you asked me earlier, about how people commit the naturalistic fallacy, because it has a certain flavor depending on what side of the political spectrum you fall on. So, for example, liberals tend to make it more like, inequality is bad, right? Like gender inequality, let's say. So any science showing gender differences must be a priori false.
Right.
So war might be bad. So any tendency that we may have toward that just can't be. So we have to reject that. And on the other end, it might be, gender differences exist, so that justifies gender inequality. Right. So many evolutionary scholars who are liberal tend to make this error, which is astounding to me. The data don't seem to reflect that being true. I mean, I'm more in agreement with Pinker on that. I mean, so Lawrence Keeley studied contemporary foragers, which are hunter-gatherers who do some basic gardening to supplement their food, and found that up to 30% of men in these societies get killed by other men. 30%.
Right.
We can look at the archaeological record, which shows massacre after massacre after massacre. Broken bones, embedded spear points, crushed skulls suggesting blunt trauma.
Right.
So that just seems to be more a function of, I don't think the problem is an evidential one. I think it's an emotional one that leads us to think that,
Yeah, when I was studying this stuff in college, I read Conrad Lorenz's book on aggression, and he had his theory that in the ancestral environment there were natural checks on fatal violence. That, for example, his example in his book was when wolves fight, the dominant wolf that eventually starts to dominate the other one, the submissive one rolls over and bares his neck and puts his chest out and allows himself to be killed, and then the dominant one stops short. Anyway, so his theory was that this is what humans were like. They stopped short of absolute violence, and therefore war is not in our genes. But that has been refuted pretty thoroughly. I mean, as you mentioned, these archaeological digs that shows significant percentage of particularly males died violently. Pinker's overall average was 25%. I mean, you and I would have a 1 out of 4 chance of dying violently as men.
That's astounding.
Yeah, That's is.
Astounding.
And I'm just reading, I don't know if you can see that, Richard Wrangham's forthcoming book, The Goodness Paradox. The paradox is we were incredibly violent. Yeah. And it's an interesting thesis about our self domestication. That is, if we were really like chimps, say spousal abuse, females, it's 100% in chimps. 100% of female chimps are physically abused by male chimps, and pretty much like every week they get beaten up. and our rates are, whatever you think they are is high. They're radically low compared to chimps. So, and then he goes on and on about this, like hunter-gatherer groups today, that when they come into conflict with another hunter-gatherer group, they don't line up and charge each other like, the French Revolution or something like this. They sneak attack.
Ambush.
And it's exactly like what's portrayed in Mel Gibson's film Apocalypto. Where at like 5 a.m, they line up and come up, and then they just hurl in and go in and try to kill as many as possible before the group can defend themselves. And, it's sneak attacks, and there's nothing particularly courageous about that. It's like, we just want to win, grab all the women, kill all the men. And it's just pretty basic. Yeah.
I mean, so I think there's no question that is a significant part of our ancestral history that has shaped so much of our politics, so much of our religions. There is, and I focus on this area because I think it's important to look at, because our tendency to do that could mean the difference between civilization and no. I mean, just think of where we would be if the Library of Alexandria wasn't burnt to the ground. For example, all of what we see around us is based on social stability, but the other side of it is, we also have the capacity to show each other great compassion, even across groups. We're able to do so, unlike any other species, I think, to cooperate, to communicate, to share economies and technology and people. That's also part of our ancestral legacy that we inherited.
Right. Right. So changing norms does have a huge effect on our genetic propensities toward violence, say, or aggression, but the norms can change back, which is the concern. I was just watching the news last night about Italy and France are in conflict now. They're upset about something or other, and it's like, boy, could you even imagine like France and Germany or France and Italy going to war?
Oh boy!
I mean, that used to be common in centuries past. Like every 2 years, one of those countries was at war with one of them. And now I can't even imagine that. But I guess it's not impossible.
So what I wonder is how much. I'm curious to hear what you think about this. Is how much has the rise of populism across the world? How much is that attributable to what's happened with us? I mean, all eyes are on us for so many reasons. We're the biggest military power in the whole history of humanity, and one of the biggest economies. So, like, how much of that was driven by the Trump phenomenon? How much did that impel other groups to turn inward and become more tribalistic on this really old, basic, primitive level?
Maybe. I mean, what you said with people taking their cues from the alpha male, there could be an effect there. I don't know. Although there's been pushback with Brexit, for example, and some of the authoritarian candidates in European countries did not win. Although Putin, I've been to Russia a couple times in the last year, and they seem to like Putin. But if you look at the immediate history after the fall and what happened in the late 90s, early 2000s, it was pretty chaotic. And there was a lot of, the Russian mafia, lots of gangs. Libertarians and classical liberals following Hayek like to talk about self-organized government and constitutions and rulemaking, and people just want to get along and have some kind of order. That's true, but if there isn't a good central government to set it up, gangs set up those rules, and then you get high rates of violence and corruption, like in Venezuela, for example. You get some strongman that takes over, and so that's a concern. So I could see why Putin is appealing again. Sure. It is chaos. I'm getting screwed right and left. If you're obeying the laws, you're a sucker. Everybody's in on the corruption. I would prefer to have somebody come in and just clean it up. And, Jared, again, back to Jared Diamond, he talks about this with the Papua New Guineans when the British government came in and they said, all right, we're taking away all your weapons. Your rates of violence are too high, and we're sending the troops in, and you're going to stop fighting. That's it. And he said most of the people were like, yeah, good, because we're tired of fighting too. You sort of have to defend yourself if there's all these conflicting tribes. It's nice to have one strong central guy come in and go, that's it, we're putting a stop to this.
And it's intuitive, right? You're absolutely right. It's a good point. So in the absence of an effective Leviathan, a dominant ape kind of serves as a stand-in. And we see this pattern among chimpanzees, sometimes oftentimes when there's an especially dominant alpha male, there's a lot more peace within the community, because and some evolutionary scholars have talked about this idea called resource holding potential, where we calculate, could we win if we challenge the order established by this dominant male? Could we do that? It's a cost benefit analysis, and if we think that we can and get away with it, that's going to happen. So in human societies, that would result in gangs taking control. That would result in mafia economies kind of bubbling up from the ground.
That's right. Yeah, I was just looking that the Federalist Paper number 51, James Madison. If men were angels, no government would be necessary. If angels were to govern men, neither external nor internal controls on government would be necessary. Then the restraint on men as well as their liberties are to be reckoned among their rights. Edmund Burke. The rest of the Federalist Paper quote, I don't have that, where the problem is once you set up a government to do the things we needed to do, who's going to check the government? So there's this constant balance there. Yes, you kind of want a strong man to clean up the mess and keep the smaller bad guys from bubbling up. Again, like Saddam Hussein, okay, he was a bad dude, but at least he kept all the other bad dudes down. And then we go in and go, well, we got to take him out because he's a bad guy. Everybody's like, yeah, you're right. He's a bad guy. He gassed his own people and so on. And now, what a mess. So it's not so easy to transfer in a democracy, because it's much simpler to just have one strong guy.
Especially in nations that are strongly based on male psychology.
Oh, right. The more authoritarian.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's stunning how huge a psychological effect a powerful male can have in these kinds of societies. So we have to understand that. We can't just assume that people are self-governable. They're not. But the interesting thing is a lot of our psychology developed, Michael, at a time where we were competing for resources. So much evidence points to this idea that warfare, you saw it more in times of droughts You saw, and among these massacre sites, you see more malnutrition. So we competed for resources when we were living hand to mouth, right? And that's what made us very competitive with one another. But now we can overfeed the world if we wanted to.
Yeah, talk about the social dominance orientation, SDO, in relation to the stuff you were talking about with authoritarian personalities and all that.
Okay, so social dominance orientation, it's another one of the foundational measures that looks at the underlying psychology of political conservatism. Basically, it boils down to how much do you want yourself or your group to have a dominance position over the other group. By and large, it maps onto conservatism very strongly. So I think when we look at conservative policy, and it tends to be far less egalitarian than liberal policy, it's based on this really old male-driven quest for resources. For example, when we give men testosterone in the research lab, they share less in laboratory games, and they score higher on social dominance orientation. This doesn't happen with so men with more upper body muscularity tend to show these behaviors as well, and we don't see this among women. So again, the same endocrine that drives aggression and sexual drives is associated with less sharing and social dominance orientation.
Right.
I mean, this is all of our politics are driven by these very basic drives to survive and reproduce.
Wasn't there something about the length of your ring finger versus your index finger? If you have a longer ring finger, which I do barely, you had more testosterone in the womb, right?
Oh, I'm not aware of that.
Yeah.
I think there.
And that gay guys have smaller ring fingers than index fingers, so they had less testosterone in the womb. So homosexuality may not be a genetic thing. In part, it may also be an embryological hormone balance thing.
Yeah, it's probably a confluence of a lot of factors, but sure. So, but I guess the biggest point is that, like so much of who we are as human beings, our politics are not what they seem, and we have to understand them.
Right, I know. You don't just think, well, how much upper body mass do I have? I'm kind of medium, I guess. This is going to determine how I vote on this or that. It's like, it seems inconceivable.
Well, the interesting thing is that it wasn't only endogenous testosterone, because people vary on how much testosterone they, but like men who are administered testosterone, they score higher than those who aren't.
Right.
On these measures.
Right.
So this is really primitive stuff. And the thing, what I always want to give a plug for is that, look, these evolutionary sciences tell us so much about who we are. They identify so many social pitfalls to avoid, but we're still fighting to have these taught in the public school system.
Yeah.
I live in Texas, where we're fighting this fight with the Texas State Board of Education that wants to inject all this false uncertainty into, evolution by natural selection.
Oh, right.
It's astounding.
Right.
The
science is the jury is still out. What jury?
Oh.
What jury where? Yeah.
The rest of the world is laughing at us for this kind of thing. It's ridiculous.
I want to ask your opinion on terrorism. So here's a kind of ongoing debate amongst atheists and others that, to what extent are Islamic terrorists, in this case, driven by supernatural beliefs in the afterlife, by their mistaken interpretation of the Quran? In other words, their motives are largely religious. If they didn't hold these insane, ideas about God and the afterlife and all this, they wouldn't be terrorists. On the other hand, you have people like, say, Bob Wright. I'm talking about like Dawkins and Harris. People like Bob Wright say, no. It has much more to do with, we have our troops on their territory. We are, America is a threat to the Islamic world. And therefore, the motivation for suicide terrorism is to drive us out of their lands. something like that. Do you have a thought on, or maybe it's both, or it's overdetermined, or I don't know what? What do you think about that?
I think just like just like every other primate endeavor, academics stake out these territories and they defend them, even false demarcations, right? Yeah, well, sure, of course, terrorists are responding to what we do in the Middle East. Does their religion impel them to does the promises of an afterlife impel them to do the things that they absolutely, there's no question. I mean, and my focus is, well, okay, this is how many of the terrorists are what's the percentage of men who are terrorists as opposed to women, and what impact is there of promising the sex that has a natural inclination to seek numbers as a mating strategy, of promising virgins in the afterlife.
72.
Yeah. 72 virgins. I mean, that is, if you really believe that,
yeah.
and you're a male, I mean, that greases the wheels for these things.
Yeah.
I mean, we would do these things to one another without religion, but religion sure makes it easier, and it makes questioning its edicts, sacrosanct, which is very dangerous when you can't question. So that's the dangers that I see in religion's role in all of this.
Yeah, I like to point out, if we were having this conversation in the 70s, we'd be talking about Marxist ideologies, Marxist revolutionaries, blowing buildings up and killing people in the name of Marxist ideology. That's not religion, but it is kind of a religion. It's a kind of a faux religion.
Yeah.
Motivates
Absolutely.
people. This evangelical at my debate this last weekend, he was making the argument that the resurrection was real because the disciples would have never gone to their deaths. They would not have gone off to jail in the name of this particular belief, because people just don't do that. It's like, are you kidding me? People do crazy shit like that all the time in the name of some belief.
Oh boy, especially that one that promises later rewards for your sacrifices. That's where the danger lies.
Yeah. I was just reading an article about the sort of precursors to monotheism in Egyptian religions, and that I forget which pharaoh it was, that one way to motivate people to build those big pyramids, because initially it was only the pharaoh was going to get to live forever and be resurrected, and then all of a sudden he granted that to the people working on the pyramid. It's like, hey, this is good for free labor.
Oh boy. And that's, so the powers that be don't want a thinking populace. That's the thing.
Right.
They don't want a populace that thinks critically. I mean, the Catholic Church selling indulgences for lessen time in purgatory or to avert hell,
Yeah.
It's an astounding ruse that continues today in a different form, when billionaires, with stock in the petroleum industry are trying to inject false uncertainty about global warming, for example. It's just a ruse.
Hey, by the way, do you have an opinion on the evolutionary origins of homosexuality? There's debates about whether it's adaptive or it's a byproduct, or.
Oh boy, I think I think it can serve. I think there's a confluence of factors that lead to homosexuality. I think it could be a byproduct. I think some people know by the time they're small. When they're children, they know that they're different. I think men tend to develop paraphilias a lot more than women, where they glom onto one particular thing that they were exposed to at some point of their development, and they're into that. That could be a factor. So I think it's complex.
Yeah. I was just reading Andrew Sullivan's latest piece on Friday in the New Yorker he's reviewing this new book about the Vatican. And basically, it's a gay secular investigative reporter who spent 4 years interviewing hundreds and hundreds of people in the Catholic Church, from low priests all the way up to the top, almost to the top. And the higher up you go, the gayer it gets. And he said about 80% of the Vatican is gay, and that it's now this stuff is all coming out. It's like, holy crap, what is going on here? It makes you wonder, are they self-selecting because that's an organization or a structure where you can essentially flourish pretty well with your say, gayness, which was not accepted historically in other communities. And so you wonder to what extent the church grew in that direction as a strategy against homophobia or something like that, or in the darker side, access to more young boys and things like that, or both.
Either way, the Catholic Church, for all of its centuries of crimes, I think deserves to be dismantled.
They
and
should
people
just
deserve to go to
just
prison.
shut it down. I mean,
Shut it
really.
down.
I mean, just
Shut it down.
have you ever been to the Vatican?
I have.
Yeah,
It's stunning.
It is
It's
stunning. They should just convert it to a big, beautiful art museum.
Yeah.
And turn it over to the people, the Italian government or something like that. I mean, it's just, it's shameful. And
Shameful.
Apparently, there's this centuries-long separation of church and state in terms of crimes. That if you're in the church, you commit a crime, the church takes care of it, not the state. So apparently, some of these people can't be arrested.
Which means they don't take care of it.
Which means they don't take care of it, right?
As we're discovering more and more and more.
Yeah, they just move them around.
Move them around.
I mean, these guys are pedophiles, a lot of them. Why are they not in jail? If you and I did this, we'd be in jail.
A lot of them.
Yeah.
A lot of them. And this stream of not questioning authority figures.
Right. The Pope is another alpha male.
Pope is not. You don't question the rules of the Pope, who's backed by the biggest alpha male in the universe.
That's right.
So
that's right. Well, Hector, congratulations on the book, Sex, Power, and Partisanship. It couldn't have come at a better time.
Yeah.
We'll see what happens after 2020. You might have to do an update depending on which way it goes. So what are you working on next? How do you so you did Alpha God and now Sex, Power, and Partisanship. What's the third in your trilogy?
Oh boy, I have so many ideas swirling around in my mind. It's finding the time to do it. Right now I'm just resting. And just doing publicity for now. We'll see if I want to embark on that again anytime soon. I don't know.
Do you teach classes? Or are you doing clinical work or?
I do clinical work and I do some clinical research. I focus on PTSD. I'm a PTSD specialist, and so a lot of my clinical research focuses on treatment outcome kind of stuff and masculine identity and how that interrelates to development of PTSD and treatment seeking, stuff like that.
Right. Is cognitive behavior therapy still considered the best treatment for that?
It's the best treatment. And I usually try to give a plug for my TED Talk, which unpackages those treatments.
Oh, good.
Look me up on TED if you know anybody who has PTSD and needs to come in for treatment. They work tremendously well. I see people all the time who come in terrible shape, and by the time they're done, they're not symptomatic.
Wow.
Yeah.
And these are mostly vets?
100%.
100% vets, right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I had Jonathan Haidt on the podcast with his new book with Greg Lukianoff, The Coddling of the American Mind.
Yeah.
Now there's an interesting debate here. Maybe give us your thoughts on this, that, their thesis is in part, why is there a spike in anxiety and depression and suicide ideation amongst adolescents? Which they identify with the iGeners, kids born 1995 and after. This is Gene Twangy's book, iGen. And so the data seems to be pretty consistent. It's like from 3% to 6% for boys, from like 5% to 15 or 16% for girls. The spike seems to be real starting around 2013, which would be when iGeners started entering college, which is about when we see all the deplatformings and safe spaces, and microaggressions and trigger warnings, and everybody seems so hypersensitive. But on the other hand, there's been two studies published this month saying that there's no correlation between social media and screen time and depression. So it may not be that; it may be the coddling thing. And what is this a real effect? Is there something really going on here? Are these kids like on the verge of PTSD from hearing, some sex story in Shakespeare or whatever, or is this just hypersensitivity and they're just calling it something? So just by way of background, the last couple of years I've been getting letters from the Disability Services Department at Chapman University excusing ex-student, one or two students every semester from taking tests in the class, participating in class discussions, giving class talks, which is all part of my seminar, right. Because they have what is their disability? Well, they don't even tell me. I'm not even allowed to ask. But if you talk to the students, because I want to help them, they tell me, well, I'm anxious. Okay. To which I say, well, good. You're supposed to be anxious when you. They all have to give an 18-minute TED talk in my class, so they feel anxious about this. To which I say,
Yeah.
good. That's because
Yeah.
you're supposed to. I feel anxious when I give TED talks, and I'm a professional. Okay.
Yeah.
But then the pushback I get from that when I mistakenly went on Twitter talking about this, it's like, no, people with real PTSD, you can't just tell them be tough and good. I'm glad you're anxious and get up there and do it. Yeah, I know. But my worry is that PTSD is a real thing, but that are we expanding the category so wide that natural anxiety that you would normally feel giving a public talk, say, anybody would feel, is now getting called this disorder, and now we're pathologizing that. What are your thoughts on that?
Yes.
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 You're worried about that?
Oh yeah. I think there are a lot of diagnostic categories that come into vogue. I think people can be overdiagnosed. I think diagnoses can be overdiagnosed. So what's the best way to overcome some of these things? Well, let me just put it this way. Bona fide PTSD, it's really hard to be around other people. You're constantly feeling like you might be under attack, and all these survival instincts kick in and flood your brain with stress hormones, things like that. But yeah, I'm sure a lot of people claim that when it's just regular test anxiety.
Yeah, so, right. But it's it's a little risky to say that now.
It is. I'll tell you what, though, as much as I'd like to continue this conversation.
Oh yeah, you got to go because you got that's
for
right.
hours.
I forgot.
I would.
Yeah.
We could just geek out for hours.
That's right. Well, we went through the book pretty thoroughly. It's a great read. I really enjoyed just paging through it because it's so relevant now. So thank you for doing that.
Oh boy, I'm just delighted to have it in your mind. Thank you for having me on.
All right, Hector. We'll talk to you soon.
Pleasure.
Bye-bye.
Okay. Bye-bye.